Last Shabbat, as we all entered the book of Bamidbar, the wilderness, I was fortunate enough to literally be Bamidbar in Israel on a women's philanthropy mission hosted by the Schusterman and Weinberg Foundations with 30 women leaders of Jewish organizations and foundations. Now you know Bamidbar is known in English as the book of Numbers because it begins with counting. Take a census of all the Israelite people. But then it goes on to say, according to the number of males, 20 years old and upward, all who are able to go forth to war in Israel. So it's not actually a census of all of Israel. Women were not counted. Our group's mission was to better understand why this millennia-old paradigm, the patriarchy, is still very much alive today. Because if you go by the numbers, it's clear that Israelite women still don't count. 2% of philanthropic dollars will go to women's issues. The last government before this one had an all-time high of women, but today there are only 9 of the 64 members of this government. There are 0 women in the war cabinet, 0 women holding major ministerial positions. Women's leadership is regressing and increasingly dismissed. I could have spent the entire trip just incensed about the depressing statistics. But numbers do not always tell the full story. And I'd like to give you a few snapshots of the amazing women who are shaping a new story. We met with Tamar Zera, who is working to get more women elected, especially mayors, because they have a lot of power in the municipalities. Currently, of 259 mayors in Israel, there are only 15 women, under 6%. Forum 31 has a goal to double that number plus 1. That's how we get to 31. Tamar learned from those trailblazing 15 women who are mayors currently that women have to be tapped, maybe repeatedly asked, in order to run. She also learned that they need an infrastructure and a peer group because it's extra lonely. So she is creating that structure for their success. And this fall, she had helped convince 88 women, a record number, to run for mayor in Israel. And then October 7th happened. And suddenly, many men, hundreds of thousands, left for reserve duty. And most of her candidates were left at home to take care of kids and try to hold down a house and earn their living. And many of them dropped out and could no longer run. One of her leading candidates, Tamar Kedem, was killed along with her entire family in the Eshkol region on October 7th. But after a few months, eventually with work, Zera got every one of them to get back on the ticket, saying, "We must do this for Tamar." And they did. We met with Kochav Elkayam Levi, who is a leading international human rights lawyer. And she quickly understood the extent that Hamas had weaponized gender violence and rape on October 7th. And within 2 weeks, she had written detailed reports of the gender violence and sent these reports to every UN agency related to these kinds of issues. She got 0 response, not even an acknowledgement that she had sent the report. Thinking that there had been maybe a mistake, she resent them. And again, heard nothing back. She shared her sense of pain and betrayal. Do they not see Israeli women as human beings? But she did not give up. She finally came in person with a cohort of other women's groups to the halls of the UN and forced them to confront the stories. For her work leading up the Civil Commission on Gender Violence, she was recently awarded the Israel Prize. We met with Dr. Safa Abu Rabia, a Bedouin Palestinian citizen of Israel. She grew up in Beersheba, the daughter of a prominent Bedouin father who was the first doctor in their community. Her parents taught her that education was the key to her independence and strength. She attended Jewish schools growing up in Beersheba. She went on to get a degree in anthropology from Harvard and a PhD from Ben Gurion University. On October 7th, she said, some of the first people who were killed were her Jewish friends in the South. But she said Hamas also killed some of her Bedouin neighbors and Palestinian Israeli friends, women wearing hijabs. They did not discriminate. Safa holds condemnation of Hamas, joy for rescued hostages, and deep pain and anger for the innocent Gazans who have been killed in the crossfires of this war, knowing that she does not feel that there is a place where she can feel all of these things and share them publicly. She said after the first few months of October 7th, she lost her voice and was afraid to ask herself who she was. But she reminded herself what her parents taught, that she was human first. And she was determined not to lose her humanity in this war. We met with Mor Yahalom, who is the first female Navy commander in Israel. She is part of Forum Devora, whose mission is to enlarge and amplify women in national security and foreign policy in Israel. Today, there are only 3 of 34 senior officers in the army. Only 5% of the military generals are women. There are still elite units who will not accept women at all. Mor is a modern-day Deborah, the biblical judge who goes on to become a warrior. She's wise, compassionate, and tough as nails. I would follow her into anything. She argued that having more women in the military leadership is not just about equity. She said, we all know, whether you're in a classroom or in a startup business, that diversity of viewpoints makes for better thinking and better decisions. I can't help but think how differently this war would be handled if Mor was in the war cabinet with all those men. And then I have to say, I saw this at the Ben Gurion Airport gift shop. That is a female Israeli IDF action figure. So I don't know if that's progress or not, but I was happy to see that in the gift shop. Then we went to Kfar Aza, Kibbutz Kfar Aza, which was one of the first kibbutzim attacked on October 7th. When you first walk in, you see trees and blooming bushes, and you understand why they felt that this was 99% paradise. We heard about Livnat, who was a former high-tech executive who left that world behind for the bucolic community and slower pace of Kfar Aza. And she would work with the children, and she collected detritus like this, garbage, and then she would make it into art like this, which was on the kibbutz. Livnat was killed on October 7th, and I want to imagine that she flew up to heaven on those wings that she created with the children of the kibbutz. We saw a fence that was breached by the Hamas terrorists. You can see this is the fence. It doesn't look like it's a lot. And you can see that there's a green field, and beyond that is Gaza. It's very close. We met with Vered Liebstein. Her husband, Ophir, was head of the regional council. He was very excited about a new project, Arazim, which was an industrial park for Gazan workers that would employ 10,000 Gazans in high-paying tech work. Each would earn an average salary of 8,000 shekels, which would have fed 60 people, each of them, in Gaza. He said, they are not going anywhere, and we are not going anywhere. We must make this better. Ophir was one of the very first names Israel announced dead on October 7th, and his dream for Arazim Park died on that day as well. Vered, who lost her husband Ophir, also lost her young adult son, Nitzan, who lived in his own studio in a section of the kibbutz for young people. He was all alone, shot and eventually died, and she also lost her nephew. It was unimaginable loss, and yet here she was back at Kfar Aza, mobilizing the women. I have no choice, she said. I will rebuild our home, and keep our community together. The day I returned from Israel, we began the holiday of Shavuot. I think of that holiday as a women's holiday in a sense, not only because the featured character of Shavuot is Ruth, and we read the book of Ruth, but also because we talk of receiving Torah as like receiving mother's milk. That's why we eat blintzes on Shavuot, in case you were wondering. That makes Torah into our ancient mother, a nursing mother. How's that for an image? And while I was in Israel, I got to meet one of our most ancient matriarchs. You see, our trip began at Anu, which is the reinvented diaspora museum, now the Museum of the Jewish People. They have recently acquired the Codex Sassoon, which is the oldest, most complete Hebrew Bible, which during the war is being held in a basement vault, but they brought it out especially for our group to see. It was scribed in Israel in the 9th century, 1100 years ago, for a Persian Jewish community, which they used with joy for many hundreds of years. But 600 years ago, when that community was under grave danger, and now that community does not exist at all, they entrusted this codex to a Muslim family for safekeeping. And for 500 years, nobody knew where it was. But they guarded it, and they kept it, and in the 1920s, this Sassoon codex, this codex reappeared, and it was purchased by the Sassoon family, who renamed it the Sassoon Codex, and then the Safra family. Now, it is no longer hidden or unknown, and it's no longer in private hands. This codex has returned to her birthplace, and she is now at Anu, a museum of all of us. And she looks quite beautiful at 1100 years old. There she is. Now, as we looked closely, we saw that the earliest cantillation markings are in this text. It was around the 9th century that the Masoretes put in vowel markings and cantillation markings, because at this point, not a lot of Jews knew how to read Hebrew. And without vowels, you didn't know the punctuation, you didn't know the grammar, you didn't know how to chant it. So this had all those markings in there. And as we stood admiring it, someone turned to me and urged me, "Can you chant from that Codex Sassoon?" And I thought, how could I not? So I stepped forward and I literally started shaking, being right in front of it, as close as I am to this Torah scroll, and thought, what do I read? And I saw right there, the page was open to the Shema. You see? Of course. So I began chanting it. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And then I invited everyone to join me, because the next part is the Ve'ahavta, which everyone knew by heart. And so at this point, all the women in the room chanted with me from this codex. And by the time we sang the Shehecheyanu, when we got done with that, we were all crying. Now, Dan Tadmore, who is the CEO of the Anu Museum and was the only man in the room, noted, "I think this is the first time that women's voices ever chanted out of that book in 1100 years." So the Codex Sassoon nursed our women's group with the milk of Torah. The voices of women were heard in the land. We knew, we counted. Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel. We are one.